everyone. This is Hariraj, CEO at Enworks. Welcome to this exciting session, really about combining assessment and development for 5x impact. Before we start, some housekeeping notes, really just as we speak, so we're going to keep it pretty open. It's a chat between me and Rathika. And as you have questions, just feel free to type that into your Q&A box. We'll take those questions as and when it comes in, or rather at logical intervals. Yeah. So we'll get started. I'm really excited about this session today because we have Rathika Bala with us to chat with me on this topic. Rathika is an organizational psychologist by profession. She and her firm, Quadrangle Consulting, is your go-to expert when you want to make psychology work for your organization and your leaders. I have collaborated with her for well over a decade on talent management solutions that impact business performance. So welcome, Rathika.
Yeah, really excited. This is a hot topic.
So today we are speaking about leadership development strategy, specifically about the importance of assessment and how combining it with development can have a multiplier effect on the impact on outcomes. So we'll really start with what has been happening traditionally. Traditionally, assessments has been like a natural precursor to development, but mostly the assessment data really comes from the data from the performance management process. And that's really how organizations have been traditionally treating things. In recent times, this logic has been increasingly getting challenged. Why past and future are really now starting to diverge. Competencies of the past are not the same as the ones required for the future. So it's starting to really get disconnected in terms of using the performance data, the data coming from the past, to be used for developmental purposes, especially when what you're looking for, when the organization is really looking at a next set of competencies, next set of skills from a future perspective. So Rathika, what's your take on this?
I think exactly the same, because when we do assessments, I very often realize that we are assessing people on competencies that are not going to differentiate them in the future. And increasingly, there is a need that I feel very strongly to start having a dialogue with clients on what are the future capabilities and then generating a very specific assessment scorecard, which can then help you do better leadership development for the people.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And again, right, I think you will hear this as a recurring theme in our conversation. Okay, a lot of things might make logical sense, but we just don't see it happening often enough. Even in this specific situation, right, when we are talking about the fact that, okay, competencies of the past are not always the competencies required for the future. Sounds very sensible, especially for companies really that are thinking transformation, thinking change, but still doesn't seem to be happening often. Why is that?
Yes, I kind of wonder. I also feel that's because most organizations look at potential in a very classical way, which is that it's a linear definition of potential. It means one common thing. And every high performer, if he has that one common thing, he or she is potential, right? But when you look at the way businesses actually grow, you can have multiple kinds of high potential individuals. You can have those who can run operations very well and scale your business. You also have those high potentials who can bring in a lot of new opportunity and transform the way you are seen in the market. Now, these are completely two different sets of people. When we are running assessments, and when you run it at the back of, let's say, a performance appraisal, it's one kind of potential, which is a set of your competencies, which are not even defining the future. But when you look at assessment today in the contemporary world, it needs to not just tell you where people are on competencies, but help you segment your high potentials into 2-3 buckets so that you can develop them differently. And I think you know this better, that the development input for somebody who's going to be your operationally excellent high potential is going to be very different for somebody who is going to grow your market, right? And I don't know if the two ever cross-pollinate.
So I think and that's really, so some of these do, right? And we see it, right? I think whenever we go through any kind of segmentation exercise, we always see there will always be a minority of individuals who
can
who have
pollinate.
the
Yeah.
versatility to cross over. Yeah, but I think this notion of not a universal fit, but
Yes.
things that fit the specific slivers of the business strategy is a very, very critical shift for most organizations to make when they think about assessments.
Yeah.
So now then let's look at yet another aspect or a disconnect that occurs when it comes to assessment and development. This is the disconnect in time, what I think of as a disconnect in time. More often than not, we see organizations doing their assessment exercises, assessment programs at a point in time, and then thinking of development exercise as something that can happen at a later point in time, much later, sometimes gaps of months, sometimes even gaps of quarters between the two.
Yes.
Is that something which you get frustrated about?
Yes. I think it's a platform to share some common opportunities and frustrations. Yes, that happens. And there are 2-3 things I think that fall apart when there is a time lapse. One is the whole understanding of competencies themselves. Because very often as an assessment partner, I go in first, right? And we work with the client and we've listed the competencies, or they have competencies that we've understood. We have run the assessment. And then there's a lapse. So there is almost like a Chinese whisper that happens between the assessment and the next partner that you have, which is your development partner, on what those competencies actually mean. Because the development partner wasn't listening to those conversations, right? Or the dialogues that the CEO had. Unless, of course, you're making your CEO repeat it again after 6 months to the development partner. So the time lapse leads to this Chinese whispers, which means what you wanted, what you assessed for, and what you developed for may not necessarily be the same, even though it's all called one competency. And I think the second is the experience of the participant, right?
Absolutely.
Because they feel assessed and then they have to deal with months of silence. And then they are often offloaded for a set of development programs. It's typically not even one partner, it's a set of training programs. And now they've lost the connection between what they were assessed for and what they are being developed for.
Yeah. And so I think the way I see it, right? And I think in my head, right, I think as you're speaking, you're making almost 3 key points in there. One is this disconnect in time, which is ironical because as companies are becoming more digital, I think for their own clients, they are speaking about more of a user-centric design. Here, we are not seeing a participant-centric design.
Yes.
If we had a participant-centric design, which is a key tenet of digital, I think you would see assessments and development all being part of a continuum with a clear messaging around it. Yeah. So that's about the disconnect in time. Pratik is also speaking about the disconnect in content, what she's describing as the Chinese whisper. So something that gets described in one way gets solved
assessed in another way,
one way, and then developed in a totally different way.
Yes.
I think then there is a third element, which is, okay, when you're trying to kind of unpack development, sometimes it's not that easy to be unpacking development. So there are complex constructs which needs to be kept together, which you need to understand as assessment is going on, right? And that's when that's not well understood, you tend to unpack the development so much that the participant really is kind of lost in the weeds, so to say, right? And they are not picking up some of the complex constructs.
And I think one symptom I see of that is when clients ask me, so what is the ROI of assessment? And I very often say, well, the ROI is development, but you aren't going to do that for a couple of months. So I don't know how to help you with the ROI, because otherwise your ROI is just the cost that you have incurred on the assessment because you haven't connected it to its next most important logical step, which is development. And I think that also explains why I now find certain organizations really hesitating to do deliberate assessment. because they think it's money that they're spending, but they don't know what the outcome is. So my typical solution to that dilemma is choose your assessments wisely, but more importantly, choose who you're doing the assessment on and to what purpose, and then link it very quickly to the development strategy without the time gap and to a
Absolutely.
purpose.
Yeah. And I think part of this is also playing out into the fact that in the past, when was not this dynamic on the business front, a lot of assessment work literally could come in and do, like, really just get some of that assessment work done. And a lot of that output could go into almost like a placement decisions or movement decisions. It didn't need to be about development, because people could almost automatically be moved onto the next set of roles and positions. Today, I think that's not the case. I mean, with the level of dynamicism that exists in business, you have to be very deliberate about development. You have to be deliberate about the fact that you need to prepare your leaders for a digital agenda or a transformation agenda or a global agenda, whatever that case might be. So just being able to really look at it and say that, okay, we need to actually follow this up with development is not something that's coming naturally to most of the decision makers, both in the HR world as well as in the business world.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's also because that the assessment and development agenda lies with different people in the HR organization, and this not necessarily rests with one individual who's seeing the picture end to end. But like the shared experience that we've had, right, that clients who run specific programs to a purpose are usually very successful in integrating assessment and development, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Identifying your high performers or critical talent base, putting them through a structured program which has a name, probably a more creative name than a Leap and an Excel, probably, and then mentioning very clearly that this program is going to develop certain futuristic important competencies, and it will have two paths, which is the assessment and development.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So, I mean, I think in terms of this whole integrated assessment and development approach panning out, what's the role of the service providers or the partners itself?
I think the most important role of the partners is to, and what I do feel is that in such a case, more often than not, you will be looking at two partners, because assessment is a very specialized area and development is also a very specialized area. So it's very unlikely that there is one organization that can offer you equal depth in both. So a good partnership as a service provider would be if everything is co-created. Now, when I talk about co-creation, it means that even when critical competencies for development are being identified for the client, the assessment and the development partner are in those dialogues together, offering insights. Because very often I may define a competency in a manner that I know is susceptible to assessment, but you may define it completely differently from a development standpoint, right? Yeah. So it's very important that we have a common understanding of those competencies articulated in a manner that makes sense to the participant, the organization, and to the purpose of your program. And then have the assessment and development phases interlaid. So while we design the assessment, the development partner actually parallelly designs the development, knowing what kind of assessment data they are likely to get and what they're going to do with that information.
So so really just understanding the context, the business context in which you're actually starting the whole thing off, understanding the logic and the design choices that the assessment partner is making is really, really critical. I mean, I've been in situations wherein, as a development partner, if I don't really understand why a specific assessment strategy has been chosen, when you could potentially make mistakes in interpreting the assessment data and the outputs that actually come your way. So even if you have the best intentions, that's not good enough. I think reality is that you've got to be immersed in the context together. And that's not, quote unquote, always very practical, in a very, how do I put it, in a very commercial.
Not very easy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not very efficient, so to say, right? And therefore, people don't tend to do it. But reality is, and I say this quite often, these are programs, initiatives that the organizations take, which have significant force multiplier effect, which means you don't try to optimize every phase, especially in terms of design effort, because that just, in my head, that's kind of like a bit penny wise, pound foolish. So you really
maximize it. You don't optimize it. You maximize
exactly.
it. Yeah, yeah.
And that if we are able to really get that into our mind, that okay, even as let's say sponsors or buyers of such programs, you must look to maximize that design effort, and that's really critical. Uh, that's on the co-creation part, the immersion part. Even from a delivery perspective, it's not easy because you make certain choices in terms of how you're assessing these leaders, and then when it comes to development, it's a different combination of competencies, skills that you're essentially figuring out. Okay, how do you actually bring them together? Sometimes it's not even based on the mechanisms; it's just based on the situation in which that leader is. So you really have to make those connections happen. And the conventional mode of saying, look, we are going to have like a cohort based approach where everyone will have a similar or identical development strategy, also doesn't play out these days.
It doesn't. Yeah. And the other thing I noticed going very well is when assessment and development, again, they're not linear. You could do assessment, development, and then again assessment and development. It need not be assessment as one cohort that happens before development starts. Because very often, even when you're doing the development, there are opportunities to measure and remeasure. And show the needle to the participant, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So this notion of being able to kind of stay almost recursive,
like a cycle, like a cycle.
That's a very important thing, and I think some of the best performing organizations out there truly understand it. They do it, and whether they do it using technology or whether they do it using a well-oiled process, it doesn't matter. The reality is they have made those design choices, right? And they do it often. Now, like I think you spoke a bit about one of the barriers, right? As possibly some of the stuff not happening is also to do with the fact that at the client organizations, it might be executed functionally, and therefore it might be split. One other thing that I have at least seen is, due to a lot of the business pressures, the organizations and the functions tend to be a lot more output oriented than
input
and outcome oriented, right? So they're chasing the milestones such as assessment completion of, let's say, 500 leaders, right? Rather than thinking in terms of the outcomes. Now, it's a bit of a systemic thing. I don't really blame the HR leaders for it. I think it's really a systemic thing wherein the business expectations are also so narrow focused, and really they start to think in terms of, okay, in 2 months, what can happen, right? How can you show me progress? So does that also play into this?
Yes, it does. And I think some of my clients have been able to overcome that because what they do is, again, it goes back to what is the end purpose you want to achieve. So let's take an example. You have a set of high-performing salespeople, and this is a B2B business, and they have to run key accounts. Now, the first assumption is, okay, there are different kinds of key accounts, and each of these require a different kind of a salesperson. And your sales numbers will go up only if this marriage between the account and the salesperson is a good fit in terms of skill, personality, and in terms of how this person runs the account. So you're in such a situation, running that cycle is very easy because you run assessment, there is a clear milestone. The assessment will also segment your people to say, okay, this set of people are good for account type A. These set of people are fit for account type B. So that is an outcome. And parallelly, then the development starts to say, hey, if these are account type A people, then I need to start developing them on specific skill set for account type A, but let me not bother about account type B. So I actually feel that while businesses are looking at milestones, this process also bite sizes it in a lot of ways. So it does not make it longer, actually. It makes it more focused.
But I think it's a very different approach to implementation itself, right? Yeah. I think organizations are catching on to it. And I think more organizations, as they catch on to it and it kind of becomes like a mainstream, a best practice, then I think this problem will get solved.
Get resolved. Yes.
Will get resolved.
Yes.
So when you think in terms of assessments to be scaled up for large organizations, what are some of the strategies that you have seen that has worked for them?
For assessments?
Yeah.
I think virtual assessments have a lot of power as far as large-scale implementation is concerned. The problem is not the virtualness of it. The problem is the reliability and the validity of the instruments that you use, and also whether you're using a single or a multiple instrument set. So the virtual environment and the digital assessment methodologies work very, very well. And very often I tell clients that in your first, depending on, of course, the level, the context and the purpose, your first level of assessment need not be very expensive and elaborate.
Okay.
But it needs to be deep enough for the development partner to pick up the most important cues and run. So it's not like you have to do 4 months of assessment and then kickstart development, because then the purpose is lost again, right? It is to say what's the minimum predictive scorecard I need to baseline my development. And then more assessment can happen during the development journey to show people where they are.
And this level of sophistication in terms of thinking about these design choices also, in my opinion, also helps them to really think about merging or combining assessment and development into one larger program, which is a lot more user-centered in terms of that experience.
Yes. And it gives you ROI at different stages. I mean, since most people still like this word ROI for our kind of work, to say, okay, you did a scorecard, you did development, then you do a bit of assessment and see if the needle's moving, help the person more with targeted insights that they can use for development. In fact, this opens a whole new opportunity, which is around self-awareness. So we start, I mean, when we say we want to give people self-awareness, itself means that we are assuming people are not self-aware. So if they're not self-aware and we give them volumes of self-awareness in the beginning, what do you think it does to them? I mean, they have all this data that's telling them, be aware of yourself, and then nothing. Then there's going to be silence for a few months. So give it to them in bite size. Okay, let's make you aware about 2 competencies where you are. And now that you're aware, let's develop you on these 2, because these 2 are the most critical to the kind of talent that you are and the potential you hold. And when you've mastered them a little bit, hey, now I can give you self-awareness on the next 2. And then you develop them on the next 2. So at the end of 6 to 9 months, you've actually developed on some competencies and given awareness on some competencies.
Yeah. And what we do some of the times is also really just try to marry the energy of the participants, because see, at the end of the day, you've got to look at it in terms of which are the focus areas of development. That's a critical part. It also is required for us to look at in the here and now, what's relevant to that leader in terms of what are they stretching towards, and really just making sure that the intersection of that's addressed, because then they have the energy to go after it. They build the confidence. Development, like everything else, right? It's just again there is a bit of a muscle memory that one builds. So initially you need a bit of that downhill slope to make things
of course
happen.
You need the positive reinforcement, right? So if you give them self-awareness on one competency and you develop it, and they can see results that, hey, I could have a stakeholder conversation which was extremely effective, and it helped me meet one of my goals, they are going to be hungry for the next assessment and the next development and so on. But by disjoining the process, we never give them those positive
we just don't.
strokes
absolutely.
at all. Yeah.
We don't. I'm just looking at some of the questions. So this is a question from Walter. He says, I love what you say about traditional assessments and potential. I understand what traditional metrics are, an end of a story, but what business needs for future orientation and support of goal achievement. I believe we need an assessment as a beginning of a new journey. What's your view on that?
I think, Walter, very true. So you do need assessment in the beginning of any journey, but you can choose how much assessment, and you can choose out of those the most important competencies on which you would want to give assessment? Because normally the future will have 7 to 8 competencies, right? And we've got to decide working with the client that, hey, will it be too much to just give self-awareness on all the 7 in one go, and then start developing each of those 7 in equal measure? Or are we saying that, hey, all the 7 are important? We realize that all of them can't be developed in 3 months. So let's prioritize which are the top 2 that we will assess, provide awareness, provide development, give the positive strokes, and then pick the next 2. Now, what these 2 will be can be common for all the participants, and these are very aligned to the larger business agenda. But sometimes they can be to the cohort, right? So if they are operational leaders, then let's pick up the 2 operational competencies first. And if they're sales leaders, then let's pick up the more go-to-market competencies first. Right?
So this is a very interesting thing, right? And I just want to add to that. So when using this term, beginning of a new journey, and I really like that term, just because. So a lot of the times we use this identity coaching to really help people explore the aspired identity as a leader that individuals have, and that really helps them to frame this as a journey. Now, like any other journey, the journey can have milestones. And I think that's the point you're making. Make it milestones that are positively reinforcing early on in the journey, so that they build that muscle, they build the almost a bit of a potential energy that they need to go after more tougher outcomes.
Yes. I think the biggest joy for me is when people say, I want to be reassessed, or I want an assessment scorecard, because that tells me they're now interested in their own self-awareness and impending development, rather than assessment being this forced exercise that literally everybody needs to go through and without an end outcome.
Yeah, I agree. I think from our team we had posted Before I take that, I think I'm just going to talk a bit about that question that we had actually set out as a poll. Which of the following strategies to increase self-awareness has worked best in your organization? I think we gave a few options, and we received like almost close to 50% indicating culture of feedback as the organizational strategy to increase self-awareness that has worked best, followed by coaching as an option, and then psychometric assessment as an option. What's your take on this?
Very complicated questions you ask people. What have people said?
So they almost 48% said culture of feedback has really helped drive self-awareness in their organization.
I would agree with that. But one of my questions when we look at culture of feedback is that feedback in organizations is colored with performance. I mean, we all may say it, I may say it, that I am completely neutral of people's performance when I give them behavioral feedback, but that's not true.
Yes.
So if people have to develop real self-awareness, they need more than just feedback. They do need a deliberate assessment. Because my behavior at work is not just about who I am, it's also the chemistry I have with my manager, the chemistry I have with my role, and the chemistry I have with my organization. While that's extremely important for self-awareness, it doesn't help me improve really until I know who I am.
Yeah.
And there's another question here, which I find very interesting, which is to say, wanting to assess leadership competency, which takes 15 minutes using some kind of a virtual tool, or do we need a 360? 360 is also one of the tools, and it needs to be used very carefully only when participants are ready to receive feedback. And very often we are ready to receive feedback when we have some level of self-awareness, right? Otherwise, we will reject that. So 360 cannot be the starting point. So you do need to use other virtual tools. But I don't necessarily agree with the 15-minute, because these are complex constructs. Can they be assessed in 15 minutes? Let me ask you that. Collaboration is very complex.
Yeah, I agree.
Can you assess it in 15 minutes? I'm not very sure. So sometimes you do need a battery of tools, maybe 2-3 tools together that will give you some indication of where the person is on collaboration. And once he or she has soaked in their own natural style, and maybe after some development, if they're willing to hear what others have to say about their collaboration, they should initiate a 360.
Yeah. I agree, right? And I think some of our experiences have been kind of indicating that. I just also want to comment on this point that you made about self-awareness, right? And this whole culture of feedback and feedback itself playing into it. I think sometimes, in some ways, right? I think the self-awareness is a too catch-all term. Awareness that you need, or self-awareness that you need in terms of figuring out, okay, what should I develop myself on, is in my head, right? It's almost a different animal compared to general self-awareness. And I think when we want to actually think in terms of, okay, my own growth as an individual, then I agree with Radhika. I think just getting the feedback alone, in a conventional sense, through a good strong culture of feedback, is not adequate, because a lot of the time that is based on our current performance, and that's not indicator of what I need to do to really prepare myself for the future.
Yeah, the other interesting question we have is the role of individual motivations. Definitely, when we were giving you examples of segmenting potential, the individual motivation is a very big part, right? Because let's take an example. My strengths are in operational, like scaling operations. But my motivation is not there. I want to become a sales leader, impacting top line. Now, the assessment needs to yield enough insight for me to take that call. That I have a very uphill task. There are 4 competencies I'll have to pick. I don't know if I can pick them or not, versus do I want to go with my strength of operational excellence and build that. So the individual is very much the center of the segmentation, as much as the scores on the assessment are. The second is also this big belief in psychology, and if you apply it to yourself, you will know that people are good at things that they're normally motivated to do, right? Yeah. So I have never found anybody who says, I am brilliant at scale, but I hate it. Because they put all their energy in that planning and optimizing and resourcing. So they're usually good at it. So the individual motivation is definitely a very big part. Okay, I think we've answered. Yes, so development is not really a lot of off work, right? You do development which is very integrated with the real work, right?
Yeah,
Hari, you want to probably talk about that a little bit?
So it's really, I'm just trying to see, taking into account that we have less time for off-work training. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah. So development has to be, again, in service of the here and now and like the immediate future. So being able to marry things back onto specific performance outcomes is really what we have seen as probably the most effective development strategies. Now, not often organizations are willing to do it that way, right? It's hyper-personalized approach. It's hard to do that. I think without the use of technology to manage it, it's really hard to do those things, especially at scale. And not even scale. Let's say, even if you are dealing with, let's say, 50 leaders, it's almost hard to do. Forget hundreds of leaders.
Yes.
So almost as a compromise, people tend to then just purely work with all leaders on 1 or 2 sets of competencies, right? And but wherever they are motivated to work on specific performance outcomes and the development is married to it, that's really where we see the almost the fastest progress, right? Progress in terms of actual shift in behaviors, shift in skills.
Yeah. So you provide them with the coaching and the group coaching and those Grit labs upfront, right? So they are carrying those skills. But where I do agree with you is I think that era of classroom training is by and large over. People are expected to do that at their own time.
Yeah.
And then really engage with the coach and the facilitator to practice the skill, take the skill to work, and then come back.
Absolutely. In fact, I would almost say it's starting to, that kind of a strategy is starting to not just happen in corporate organizations, but it's almost starting to move into the realm of even education. So I think it's absolutely.
So coming to your question, Walter, yes, I wish leaders would have more extensive training in listening, empathy, communication, assertiveness, so that they can provide more valid feedback at work. But I think we all need to recognize that organizations have a business to run, right? So if you look at any manager, he needs to spend 95% of his time running business and not really becoming the reality is they're not going to become coaches,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And if you give them an assessment scorecard, they can use those conversations become easier for them. And also, I think it's the surprise. I don't know if you felt that, but I've had that experience one when I have a view of somebody as that person's manager. And then I see the assessment report and I'm very surprised, right? And I kind of wonder that is it me? Because I haven't been able to utilize somebody's strength or I'm not seeing the strengths that are there in the report. And that changes my style as a manager too.
We see it so often.
So often.
Yeah.
So I think the role of assessment is also to help the manager get a perspective of this individual outside of the dynamic of the relationship that the two people share.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? I think especially in this kind of environment where the business directions tend to shift every, let's say, 2 or 3 years, this level of inputs being available to the managers, it just makes them a lot more powerful, right? I think in being able to maximize and kind of get the best version of their team in play.
Yeah. And you're also right in saying that leaders prefer bite-sized learnings. They also do not want to waste their time on anything which they can't see value in to their roles. And that is also why even the assessment, forget the development being bite-sized, even the assessment needs to be meaningful. I mean, I'll feel guilty of making a leader spend 20 minutes on an assessment which I don't know what it's going to lead to, right?
Yeah.
So choosing the assessment, then choosing the development, and then getting those positive strokes is going to solve this problem.
And I've seen you ask those questions, right, to the client stakeholders as to, okay, why do you want to do it, right? And until there is clarity on it, I think it just doesn't make sense for us to really go. But what's also not apparent, honestly, to leaders, HR leaders, business sponsors, is the multiplier effect on impact that this combination of assessment and development has. It's like, I think in how I see it, right? I think in combination, this can deliver on talent outcomes such as creating a leadership bench to support almost 80% of the business growth as opposed to maybe conventionally supporting 20% of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think to me, that's what...
that's the ROI.
Yeah, that's the ROI. And that's what has to drive sponsors to almost embark on a unified program that requires careful planning, unified branding or positioning, securing buy-in for a longer duration execution. But the returns are kind of worth it because what it also does, honestly, is once you start to deliver on those kind of outcomes, it builds the trust from business in the HR organization on being able to deliver core outcomes that matter to the growth, that matter to the change in the business situation.
And the transformation agenda.
Yeah. It starts to become, so I think almost that's the secret, right? So being able to bring assessment and development together literally elevates this from being a pure talent initiative to becoming a business initiative. And I think once that is well understood, that's well understood by stakeholders, and I know many stakeholders, many sponsors who truly understand it. It's still not easy to navigate the organizational dynamic to be able to kind of get enough buy-in within that organization. Like what Radhika said, businesses and leaders have a business to run, so they have very little time. How do we actually make it amenable?
Worth it while. Worth it while, and worth the penny that they're spending on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really where this is going to play out. So my real ask, right? I think if you have to take away one thing, it's about the fact that if you combine assessment with development, you can elevate it from being a talent initiative to truly becoming a business initiative.
Yeah.
And we see top-notch organizations doing that then almost as a recurring process on their corporate calendar, right? They are able to do this year in and year out. Some of them they stagger it and do it almost every quarter. They are working with different segments.
Yes, exactly.
So, folks, that's really what we wanted to share today. Any final thoughts? Anything else that you would like to speak about?
I think probably the same message that you've given, that don't do assessment and development as independent activities. Do them, give them meaning together if you want to see results. I think we've addressed all the questions.
Absolutely. So
thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining in. And one quick announcement I want to make is we are starting a Ask the Expert campaign and a program wherein I think some of us are part of a curated panel. We will be available kind of for, let's say, a 30-minute consultation if you want to really speak about your leadership strategy that your business is facing. You just need to share with us the kind of context in which your organization is, what your goals are, and we can absolutely speak to you about your leadership strategy. Really, just it's something which just we want to offer. I think just really for the next few weeks. I think it's available to you in the month of October. So something, do take a look at it. I think you will see a link for Ask the Expert campaign as part of the webinar itself. Please do take a look at it. I think as you exit the webinar, you will get a survey on to seek your feedback on how these things are being organized, what topics are coming through your way. Please give us feedback so that we can actually do better in the coming sessions. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.